Oh, Father, thank you for another day, Lord. Thank you for the air in our lungs and the opportunity to gather here today. Thank you that we have a place to gather, Father. And I just pray for everybody over on the East Coast right now, Father, that you'd work in their lives, speak to them, Lord, that they'd see your face and everything that's happening over there right now. And I just pray for their safety as well. And I pray for everybody in Florida right now, Father, that you would minister to them down there, and that they would definitely see your face there as well. And I just pray that as we go through your word tonight, that you would speak to everybody here, and that everybody would come out with something to learn, Father. I just pray you'd speak to me, Lord, and let me remember what I studied. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, guys, so today we'll be in Genesis 31, if you guys want to open up there. And just to kind of recap, it's kind of important in this chapter because, like Tyler was saying last week, these couple chapters here, they all kind of work together. And so now that we were able to progress further into Genesis, we'll understand a couple things, right? So remember in Genesis 28, right? Isaac tells Jacob, hey, you got to flee, go find a wife, right? So he's leaving, and then his conversion happens there, right? Remember his dream, right? And so later on, he's moving. He finally gets to Laban's house. He starts working for his wives, right? And after the 7 years, he gets Leah. After the other 7 years, now he has the right to Rachel as well, right? So he's working there for 14 years, and we'll see that later in this chapter as well. And then Laban says, hey, can you please stay, right? You're helping me out. We're gaining wealth here. Will you stay? And he goes, yeah, for sure, for a portion of your flocks, right? And we remember last week that all he asked for was any of the spotted, blemished lambs, right? And so Laban's like, oh, that's a wonderful deal, because those are a little bit more rare and less desired. So Jacob says, yeah, this is what I want. And so we see that, as last week, Rachel and Leah are fighting over who gets the most kids. They're fighting over the love of Jacob. Jacob seems to be choosing one or the other, and in different ways. We talked about that. And then he starts working for Laban, right? So then that leads us right here into chapter 31, verse 1. Now Jacob heard the words of Laban's son, saying, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from what was our father's he has acquired all his wealth. And Jacob saw the countenance of Laban, and indeed it was not favorable towards him, as before. Then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your family, and I will be with you. Right, so right off the bat, we're seeing that now there's a little bit more family strife happening here, right? Now, last week we dealt with the internal family of the wives. Now it's the cousins and such, correct? And so they're upset with him, and they're like, he's taking everything we have. Now, that's not necessarily true either, right? Because if we remember, it was a business deal. Well, Jacob and Laban were both kind of scheming, and they're both trying to work for the better of themselves and their families. Well, the deal was that Jacob would get all the blemished and spotted and streaked lambs. So in Laban's son's view, he's kind of scamming his family. But what God's plan here is that Jacob is increasing faster than Laban. Right, and Tyler discussed that last week, and it says that he's acquiring all of our father's wealth. So it's kind of selfish here as well, right? Because they're viewing it as their inheritance is at stake here, right? They're thinking that the cousin, the foreigner, comes out of the land of Canaan, comes back here to find a wife. Well, now he has our sisters, and he's taken everything our dad has, and so it kind of shows the envy right there, right? And that's one of the things that is interesting, because different, as I was preparing for this study, different people have different views. The one that everyone did have is there was envy here, right? They were being selfish. They wanted what he was having. Meanwhile, Jacob's just doing what he was told by God, right? And so I think that's something to keep in mind, is to the outside world, the things that we're doing or we should be doing might look weird. They might look wrong in the eyes of the world. Jacob's being obedient here. And it says, and then Jacob, right, he's hearing this from Laban's kids, and now he sees that because of this, the envy here, that it's starting to kind of work into Laban's heart as well, right? And we can see that because last week, Laban was pretty thrilled with the idea of, oh yeah, you can have these spotted lambs. And so they both made the deal that they'd take Jacob's flocks and put it over here, and Laban's flocks over here. And we'll see that later in this chapter as well, and why that was important. And Laban was doing it so that when the sheep were breeding, there wouldn't be those genetics passed down. So that was where Laban was trying to gain his wealth, and Jacob put him over on his side. And so because of Laban's kids, Laban starts freaking out a little bit, and his favor is starting to run away. And so Jacob is sitting there, and he hears from God again, right? And he says, "Return to the land of your fathers and to your family, and I will be with you." So this goes on with everything we've seen into Genesis this far, right? If you're doing God's will, he's here with you. And so no matter how many times Jacob's told, "Hey, I'm with you," he still kind of forgets, right? And that's something we all kind of do. So we'll see that here in a second. It says, "I'll be with you." In verse 4, so Jacob went out and called Rachel and Leah to the field to his flock, and said to them, "I see your father's countenance, that is not favorable towards me as before. But the God of my father has been with me, and you know that with all my might I have served your father. Yet your father has deceived me and changed my wages 10 times, but God did not allow him to hurt me. If he said thus, 'The speckled shall be your wages,' then all your flocks bore speckled. And if he said thus, 'The streaked shall be your wages,' then all the flocks bore streaked. So God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me. And it happened at this time, when the flocks conceived, that I lifted my eyes and saw in a dream, and behold, the rams which leaped upon the flocks were streaked, speckled, and gray spotted." Verse 11, "Then the angel of God spoke to me in a dream, saying, 'Jacob.' And I said, 'Here I am.' And he said, 'Lift your eyes now and see all the rams which leap on the flocks are streaked, speckled, and gray spotted, for I have seen all that Laban is doing to you.'" Right? So Jacob goes, "Okay, it's time to go. The family's starting to fight here. I don't want to be part of it." So he goes and he finds Rachel and Leah. And I think it's interesting because he kind of separates them here, right? He brings them to the flock. And I think not only is he separating them so the rest of the family and their siblings, I think, aren't necessarily hearing the plan here, but also to kind of prove his point. And he's saying, "Hey, your dad's, he's not favorable towards me anymore." And so he starts explaining everything, right? Now, I'm sure that they would have been aware of a lot of the stuff's happening. That's why he says, he's changed my wages 10 times. Every time we agreed to something, he's changed it. And when that's come to fruition, he's changed it again. And so he pulls them aside and he starts breaking down this dream, right? And this is where last week Tyler's kind of like, it's all in your chapter. And this is what it all is climaxing to right here, in this chapter at least. And it's saying that in his dream, God was telling him, "Hey, I'm with you. Don't worry about it. Everything's going to plan." I think it's kind of important, right? Because it definitely shows that Jacob's a little bit of a dreamer. And it's important here because not only does God remind him, "I'm with you," up in verse 3, it also, it starts showing that, I just forgot what I was talking about. So he's, God's with him, and he's starting to explain to Leah and Rachel, "This is why I know. This is the God of my fathers here," right? And so it goes into the discussion, okay, Laban's stealing everything from him, is what he's claiming, right? And the one thing, this is John Corson, when I was studying, he had a different view on this. He goes, yes, there's envy, but you're more likely to see the bad in somebody when it's worse in you, right? And so this kind of goes back to all these studies up to this point is, Laban's out here kind of doing back unto Jacob what Jacob's doing to him, right? And you can find that in multiple places. Sometimes they're doing good, and other times they're arguing, right? And so, he says wages were changed 10 times, and he's definitely trying to convince him here, right? It's like, it's time to go. And then he goes down here to verse 11, "Then the angel of God spoke to me in a dream, saying, 'Jacob,' and I said, 'Here I am.'" And so this is important because ever since Genesis 28, when Jacob had that conversion, when he realized, okay, God's real, right? I've known this my whole life. I've been raised this way, but now he's in my life, okay? And so it's important because Jacob right away, he's already shown in the above verses here that he's doing what God's told him in his dream. And he's also saying, "I'm here. I'm listening. I'm ready to go." And he said, "Lift your eyes now and see all the rams which are on your flocks," right? And so this is kind of like, this is why I'm saying he's a dreamer. right? So God tells him, this is what I'm asking you to do, and he starts seeing what is available to him. And this is important too, because as we've seen, he's worked super hard up to this point, and we're going to see that later in the rest of this chapter as well. And he's worked as hard as he can, which is automatically something that we need to keep in mind there as well, is he's working for what he has. And I also think this is important to mention too, as he's saying, he's going through this. It's verse 13 says, I am the God of Bethel. So he's reminding Jacob, hey, remember your conversion here? Remember how we already had this conversation? I'm the same guy. I'm the same God. And that's important because where he came from, he came out of the land of Canaan from, where he was rich. He was well known, right? He's converted, and now he's in a foreign land again. And as we'll see, there's plenty of idolatry of all kinds. And so when you're around those kind of people, it's important that sometimes you need a little bit of a reminder, right? And so he's going, Jacob, I am the God of Bethel, which is also important here because if I understand correctly, this is a Christophany, right? This is another sign of this is Jesus in the Old Testament, right? And so it's important here because in Malachi chapter 3, verse 6, it's talking about how, I'm the same yesterday, today, and forever, right? That's the gist of it. That's paraphrasing. You can look at that, but that's the point. And it's he's reminding Jacob, and that's an application point that we can have as well. Is it's a good reminder that no matter what we're going through, God's with us, and he's the same God yesterday, today, forever, right? He doesn't change. Also goes to show that because he was willing to, get up off his butt, he was willing to go and work, that God blessed him through that as well, right? And we see that in James 1. You guys can look at that at a later time as well. Now arise and get out of this land and return to the land of your family. That's the end of verse 13. And verse 14, then Rachel and Leah answered, verse 14, then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, is there still any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? Right? So he's going, guys, this is what God's told me, and it's time to go. Right? And this is something interesting too, because right here in verse 14, we'll read down from here. Then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, is there still any portion of inheritance for us in our father's house? Are we not considered strangers to him? For he has sold us and also completely consumed our money. For all these riches which God has taken from our father are really ours and our children's. Now then, whatever God has said to you, do it. So this kind of goes to show, in the previous chapter, they're arguing, they're fighting, their heads are butting the whole time because they want to be number one. Now all of a sudden he's going, God's told me this is the plan, and it's time to go. And they're going, okay, that makes sense. Right now there's a common enemy here because in their viewpoint, their father has taken everything from them. Right? It says, are we not strangers by him? Right? So there must have been something going on there just on the family level after the marriages and all that. And he goes, there's nothing left for us here. He goes, are we not considered strangers by him? For he has sold us and also completely consumed our money. For all these riches which God has taken from our father are really ours and our children's now. So they're agreeing with him, going, okay, yeah, we see where this is all coming from. We're seeing where you're working. And because our father has given the inheritance to other people, or he's consumed the money in his business dealings, they're understanding that the blessings that God's given Jacob are also theirs because they're married, right? And they're also the kids. And that's important to think there as well, right? Because, when you get married, right? This was something that we kept working on in the premarital counseling. When you get married, you're a team, right? You've become one flesh. And that's important because if you're arguing the whole time and you're fighting like they were previously, it's harder to get things accomplished. No one's on the same page. And they're understanding here now that the riches God has taken from our father really are ours. They're understanding the blessings because we're all one family. These are ours now. And not only are they ours, they're also our children's. Right? And so then it says, and at the end of verse 16 here, it says, now then, whatever God has said to you, do it. So they're on the same page. They're ready to go. And that's something interesting because that's not always the way to look at things, right? There's always sometimes you got to communicate, but they're understanding, right? They've seen what's happening. So the verse 18 here, verse 17. Then Jacob rose and set his sons on the wives' camels, and they carried away all of his livestock, all of his possessions which he had gained, his acquired livestock which he has gained in Padam Aram, to go to his father Isaac in the land of Canaan. when I read verse 18, I thought that was pretty interesting because Jacob's been gone for 20 plus years at this point, right? About that time. And it's interesting to think because a lot can happen in 20 years, right? Sometimes it just feels like every single day is, the same day, right? Everything's the same. And I think that's interesting because that's something I struggle with at times, is just going, okay, it's just another day, right? It's all the same. But a lot can change in just a short amount of time in our lives. And so he's been gone for 20 years. And so when it said, and go to his father Isaac, it definitely implies there that he has some knowledge that his dad's still alive. And I think that comes from verse 3 when he's dreaming and talking with God there. And it says, go back to the land of your family, right? Because as we remember, when he left, he was the one that got the firstborn rights, right? And so his brother was trying to kill him, and that's part of the reason he left. But after 20 years, he has some remembrance that his father is still there, and he goes to the land of Canaan. Verse 19, now Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel had stolen the household idols that were her father's. And Jacob stole away, unknown to Laban the Syrian, in that he did not tell him that he intended to flee. So he fled with all that he had. He rose and crossed the river and headed towards the mountains of Gilead. And Laban was told on the third day that Jacob had fled. Right? So they get all on the same page, and he's like, it's go time. They're bugging out. They don't have time to sit around and twiddle their thumbs. And that's something else to keep in mind. When God says go, it's go time. If he says stay, take a deep breath, because you're probably about ready to get moving again. And that's something you see all through the Old Testament, is the church, Israel, has always been moving. They're never stagnant. So if we're stagnant in our lives and we're not in the Word, we're not studying, we're not working for the betterment of God and the church, right? That's when things start falling apart. That's when things get tough. So it also goes to show right here in verse 17 how Jacob rose and set all his sons on wives and camels. So he had the wealth. He had the ability. God had blessed him enough where when it was time to go, he had just enough faith to hear God and go. He put them all in camels, and they're going as quickly as they can, right? Because it says right down here, a couple verses down, that, he didn't even tell Laban, right? And so, Laban had gone to shear the sheep. Rachel had stolen the household idols, which were her father's. And I guess there's some, debate and speculation there on why, right? And it doesn't necessarily say, but at least right in this chapter. But some of the ideas were, she either believed in those idols still, that there was some traditions that the idols of the household were kind of like deeds to the property. So she thought that if she took them, it could have meant the property became hers. The inheritance would become hers. It could have just been she was angry at her father, what he had done to him. So she's like, well, we'll take these. And so she loads them up, and he takes them with her. And when I read that, I was like, okay, that's kind of interesting, right? I didn't say it. It's kind of interesting. And anyhow,
you found that interesting?
I found that fascinating, Tyler. And so she loads them up, and it's kind of like one of those things. Everyone harped on this, saying, imagine being able that your gods could be picked up and stolen, right? Now that's one of the cool things, the blessings that we have, right? The God of the heaven and the earth that spoke things into existence, you can't steal him from us, right? You can't steal him from you, because once you've received him, you're one of his. And that's awesome. That's a huge blessing there. But it also, as I got thinking about it, I was like, okay, well, she stole his idols, right? And that's, the first couple in the 10 Commandments, don't have any gods but me. Well, that's easy to say, oh, well, we don't have any of those, yet we have cell phones, we have cars, right? And, you might be like, oh, that's not my idol. Well, when your phone goes missing for a couple minutes, right? Or you get that text message like, oh, I got to look at it, right? Or your cars are just a wonderful thing, or you like fishing, whatever the case is. It's easy to make idols. It's easy to make things that you love. And so I wasn't teasing you guys. That was in my notes. But it just makes you think, are there other things that you put in importance before God? Right? One of the things I've been really focusing on in the mornings is when I wake up, I'm like, oh, I'm breathing again. That's pretty cool. And then I'm like, I'm breathing again. All right. You know, and I try to remember, I'm trying to consciously remember to thank God for that. Because, you know, we are blessed more than some people, right? You know, and the fact that I got to wake up, I appreciate that, because that's pretty cool. And so, it's cool, right, Dean? That's just something I've been focusing on is, okay, what is the first thing am I doing in the morning? Am I turning the coffee pot on? Am I checking my text message? Or am I waking up and going, thank you, God, for letting me wake up again? And so that's been one of my personal challenges. So I guess that's, you know, like Tom says, you know, this is your challenge this week. That's the challenge I'm giving you guys, is try to remember God before you remember your coffee, before you remember your cell phone, before you remember your car, before you check your text messages. Plus, that's just good for your brain to not be on your phone right away. And so she loads the idols up, and Jacob's not aware of this. And this is an important detail to remember here. Verse 20, and Jacob stole away unknown to Laban the Syrian, and that he did not tell him that he intended to flee. So he fled with all he had, arose, crossed the river, and headed towards the mountain of Gilead. And Laban was told on the third day that Jacob had fled. So that right there implies that, you know, he was waiting for just the right opportunity, or God was working just in God's ways, that Laban was already gone. He was out shearing the sheep, and also the fact that it took 3 days for him to find out meant that he was working hard and he was out and about. On the side note, on like the lesser scale things, that kind of goes to show that no matter what position you are in your life, right? Because Laban was a wealthy man, and he had, you know, a lot of flocks. He was still out there doing the work, right? So no matter where you're at in life, don't forget that sometimes it's still okay to scrub toilets, right? He's still out there shearing sheep. If you ever watched anyone shear a sheep before, that's an event, right? You see sometimes like you get like a fully grown guy out there, he's trying to wrestle a sheep, and it's like, I don't want nothing to do with this. And that goes into the analogy of, oh, well, we're the sheep, and, you know, Jesus is the shepherd, and we are always struggling with him. And then eventually you get like this little 8-year-old kid come out, throws it on the ground, like ties it up, and they start shearing it, right? And so that's just something fun, right? I just thought that was interesting. But yeah, so he's out there, he's working hard, and he gets told after 3 days. Then he took his brother in with him and pursued him for 7 days' journey, and he overtook him in the mountains of Gilead. So that's interesting. So when Jacob loads his family up, this isn't like, you know, family vacation, like I said before. They're moving, right? It took Laban and his buddies 7 days to catch back up. And so they were moving quickly. Journey overtook him in the mountains of Gilead. But God had came to Laban the Syrian in a dream by night and said to him, be careful that you speak to Jacob neither good nor bad. So Laban overtook Jacob. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the mountains, and Laban with his brother pitched in the mountains of Gilead as well, right? And this one was interesting. And so when I was sitting this, there's a, when you translate to English, it just gets put God, right? We have a capital G there, which is how we can tell differently, but this was Yahweh, right? This is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which is important because at this time there wasn't a Bible, right? There was written tradition, there was oral tradition, and people were made aware that Jacob was the grandson of Abraham. He was rich. But this is important to realize that this is Yahweh speaking. This isn't one of the other gods that, you know, he's hunting down because they got stolen. And that's the important part to recognize. God speaks to him in his dreams, be careful and to speak neither good nor bad. And I thought that one would kind of stumble me. He's like, okay, well, why would God be telling him not to speak neither good nor bad? Obviously, we can understand, you know, hey, he's my kid. Don't be like hurting on him. But the good part kind of got me confused. So if anyone has any ideas on why he said don't speak good on him, the only thing I could kind of think was maybe he didn't want Jacob to get stumbled and go back with him. That was like the only thing I could really think of personally. Because normally, you know, you're always supposed to be loving to your neighbor, you know. And so when it said that confused me. So I guess after we can discuss that one. And so God tells him, you know, don't hurt him, don't talk bad to him. And they pitch their tents in the same places. And so also during my research, the interesting thing is the time that they were moving quick. It was about 300-ish miles that he had traveled in the 7 days on his camels, which goes to show that, you know, Laban was moving even quicker, which makes sense at the same time because, you know, we'll see that here in just a second, I guess. So Laban overtook him. They pitched the tents, verse 26. And Laban said to Jacob, "What have you done that you have stolen away unknown to me and carried away my daughters like captives taken with the sword? Why did you flee away secretly and steal away from me and not tell me, for I might have sent you away with joy and songs, with timbrel and harp? And you did not allow me to kiss my sons and my daughters. Now you have done foolishly in so doing." Verse 29, "It is in my power to do you harm, but the God of your fathers spoke to me last night, saying, 'Be careful that you speak to Jacob neither good nor bad.' And now that you have surely gone, because you greatly long for your father's house. But why did you steal my gods?" And so the next couple, the last part of this chapter, you get into some longer dialogue here, right? They catch up. He comes up and says, "Hey, man, yeah, that's like, you didn't even tell me you were leaving." And so there was a little bit of disrespect here, obviously, right? And so he goes, you took my daughters away captive, carried them away, my daughters, like captives taken with a sword. Why'd you flee away from me secretly? He's like saying, if you would have at least told me, I could have said goodbye to my family. I could have potentially given you this awesome, goodbye ceremony. Now, knowing Laban and Jacob, that's kind of one of those things people are speculating on, of going, it is tradition to, when your guest leaves, to be like, there's your feast, and, they walk them out, and it's awesome. But at the same time, they've gone back and forth so many times. Like it says, his wages have changed 10 times. They weren't necessarily on the same page, and especially how in the beginning of the chapter, it said their accountants had fallen. And so I just imagine in my life when something like this happens to me, maybe not to this extent, right? Because I don't have any kids that are being stolen away. But if something happens, sometimes it is nice to have the little bit of time before you address it. Because if Laban would have found out before, he could have potentially killed Jacob and took his family back, right? But the fact that Jacob left and it took so long to catch up, he's able to at least talk to the guy. And I'm sure this was a very heated argument. This isn't just like, come on, dude, you kind of stole my family. It's probably more like, are you kidding me? Why did you do this? And so it goes down. He's like, you did not allow me to kiss my sons and my daughters. Now have you done foolishly in doing so? And verse 29, I think this is important. It says, it is in my power to do you harm, right? So Laban's here under the impression that because you've done this, I have every right to harm you. I have every right to kill you and take my family back. But luckily for you, God said, don't do that. And that's why I distinguished, that this is obviously the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob here, Yahweh, because his whole purpose on coming out here, he says is, oh, we're looking for the stuff you stole from me. And there's plenty of deep conversation here. But he's like, but the God of your fathers. And I always like reading that as I'm going through the Old Testament, because it really shows the relationship here, right? And it shows an identity. Like when we give our life to Christ, we become part of that family. That's our God, right? It's not like we're out here looking for, Baal or anything like that. So it's his identity, and I think that's awesome. Verse 30, now you've surely gone away because you greatly long for your father's house. But why did you steal my gods? And I kind of like that because it's kind of the cherry on top. He's like, I understand why you left. I knew at some point you would want to go back to your family, your land. And then I like the way when I read this, it's like he goes through this whole argument. He's spilling it all out on Jacob, and he goes, but why? You stole my gods? You're out here saying you have a God. You stole mine. Right. Verse 31, then Jacob answered and said to Laban, because I was afraid, for I said, perhaps you would take your daughters from me by force. And that's understandable to some extent, right? They're both kind of on the same page here. Laban knows he wants to go back, and Jacob goes, I was kind of afraid of you, dude. You have power too. At the same time, we've seen in verse 3 of this chapter, God was with him. And so, they've written songs on, don't be afraid, right? The only thing you should fear is the Lord himself, right? And it kind of goes, and that word is used for respect and the whole nine. That's a different study. But why was Jacob afraid? He's talking to God. He's dreaming dreams. He's had experiences that we've never had. right? And it's kind of like, in the Gospels when Jesus is talking to Thomas saying, you're lucky you get to walk with me, but even luckier are the people that get to have faith. And so Jacob's sitting here and he's afraid. And it's crazy to think, oh, well, I wouldn't do that. But we all know deep down that if we were in a situation like this, fear overtakes people. And he's worried. He's like, I was worried you'd take my family from me by force, right? And verse 32, with whomever you find your gods, do not let him live. In the presence of your brethren, identify what I have of yours and take it with you. For Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen them. And Laban went into Jacob's tent, into Leah's tent, into the two maids' tents, but he did not find them. Then when he went out of Leah's tent, he entered Rachel's tent. Now Rachel had taken the household idols, put them in the camel's saddle, and sat on them. And Laban searched all about the tent and did not find them. Verse 35, and he said to her father, let it not displease my lord that I cannot rise before you, for the manner of woman is with me. And he searched but did not find the household idols. All right, and so Jacob goes, listen, man, I don't know why you're hunting me down. I was afraid. You can search everything I have, and I can guarantee you I don't have these idols. Because he didn't know that Rachel stole them, right? And so everyone's like, oh, I bet you Rachel is sitting over there in the tent going, uh-oh, right? Because you don't want to be the person that, your husband makes this grand statement and all of a sudden, but actually you are guilty, right? And we'll see that here in a second. Verse 36, then Jacob was angry and rebuked Laban, and Jacob answered and said to Laban, what is my trespass? What is my sin, that you have so hotly pursued me? Although you have searched all my things, what part of your household things have you found? Set it here before my brethren and your brethren, that they may judge between us both. These 20 years I have been with you. Your ewes and your female goats have not miscarried their young, and I have not eaten the rams of your flock. That which was torn by beasts I did not bring to you. I bore the loss of it. You required it from my hand, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. There I was in the day the drought consumed me, and the frost by night, and my sleep departed from my eyes. Thus I have been in your house 20 years. I have served you 14 years for your 2 daughters, and 6 years for your flock. And you've changed my wages 10 times. Unless the God of my father, the God of Abraham, the fear of Isaac, has been with me, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. God has seen my affliction and my labor, and my hands have rebuked you last night. So this is kind of like, after 20 years, Jacob finally gets this all off his chest. He's like, this is ridiculous. I've worked for you harder than any of your other employees. I've worked for everything I've had. And it goes, the shepherd he would have had to be so disciplined that he was with the ewes, he was with the goats. None of them miscarried, and he's not eating the rams of his flock. He's saying, I provided for myself. I did not eat anything you had here, right? And it says, verse 39, it says, that which was torn by beasts I did not bring to you. I bore the loss of it. I bore the loss of it. And so he's basically saying here, I guess there's a tradition at the time saying, if like a wolf or something came and like grabbed the sheep or the goat and it killed it, is kind of like a sign of respect to the owner saying, hey, I didn't let that animal take that away. I went down there and I got it, and they'd bring it back. And it's kind of like a sign of, okay, you're doing a good job. It's a forgiveness. You don't have to buy this lamb. And he goes, and Jacob goes, I didn't even do that. I didn't even follow this tradition. If something happened to it, I replaced it, right? He goes, you required it by my hand, whether it was stolen by day or stolen by night, right? He's like, I was in charge of this flock, and I protected this flock. And you have the audacity to come out here and say I stole something from you, right? It goes, all the sleepless nights, all the cold nights, my eyes were so tired and I stayed awake. It says that right there in verse 40, right? And it goes, I've been here for 20 years. I've served you. You know me, and you're coming out here chasing me. And the only reason he was able to say that with a straight face was because he didn't know what his wife had done. He had this built up in his heart that after 20 years it finally exploded. In both of these conversations, this wasn't like, like I said, like some peaceful thing. These guys were mad, right? And you definitely get that as he's reading it. He gives all these reasons that he's such a great guy. and that why you should trust me. But this kind of goes back to that broken family communication relationship, right? Because his wives were fighting so much, and he wasn't, more than likely being a great husband at the time either, that when they finally said, let's go, and they seemed to be on the same page, he still lied, right? Now you can say, oh, well, he didn't know, but he's still responsible in some aspect of that, right? And so, verse 43, and Laban answered and said to Jacob, these daughters are my daughters, these children are my children, and this flock is my flock. All that you see is mine. But what can I do this day to these my daughters and to their children, whom they have borne? Now therefore, come, let us make a covenant to you and I, and let it be a witness between you and me. So Laban's sitting here going, that's cool and all, but this stuff's still all mine. And I'm sure that got under Jacob's skin, because like he just said, I've been here 20 years, dude. I earned this. And Laban goes, meh, it's still my stuff. Right? And I guess right there where he says, these are my daughters, it's probably more of a statement like, hey, these are my daughters. These are my grandchildren. The flocks, that one right there kind of gets me, because they weren't his. And they already had an agreement together. So it shows that Laban earlier was working hard. It shows Jacob's working hard. They had stuff so they could separate, so there couldn't be these issues. And there's still issues. Right, and this is the it gets right here, right? So after they break this down, he goes, okay, fine, it's my stuff. Let's make a covenant. And this kind of is like the end of the chapter here, right? And he goes, now therefore, come and let us make a covenant, you and I, and let it be a witness between you and me. So Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar. Then Jacob said to his brethren, gather stones. And they took stones and made a heap. And then they ate there on a heap. Laban called it Jagar Shadueth. I don't know how to say that, guys. But Jacob called it Gilead. And Laban said, the heap is a witness between you and me this day. Therefore, its name was called Gilead. Also, Mizpah, because he said, may the Lord watch between you and me, when we are absent one from another. If you afflict my daughters, or if you take other wives beside my daughters, although no man is with us, see God as a witness between you and me. All right, so I think that's interesting, because up to this point, Jacob's like, hey, you and your buddies, go search my stuff, right? There's witnesses here, because I'm guessing at some point Jacob's realizing, because there haven't been witnesses through the rest of my, time being here, it's time there's other people that, can hold us both accountable. Until this spot, it says, there's nobody here with us but God. Right? See God as witness between you and me. And so they go through and they make the pillar. They all eat there, right? It's kind of like a show of we're working together. And then also in verse 49, mitzvah, I guess that I've never heard this before, but I guess it's one of those things like people put on necklaces, God's watching us, this and that. And meanwhile, it's like, if you cross my side of this pillar, I'm going to kill you. And so I thought that one was interesting. I was like, okay, well, it's a fun word until you break down the context. And I guess that was kind of one of those traditional things that people gave to. Jean's over there nodding her head. Yeah. And he goes, okay, the Lord's going to watch you. And it's kind of like one of those things. He's like, you're being held accountable because the Lord is with you. And I like how there's kind of this shift. He's going from, okay, the idols that he's looking for, his gods. He's aware of Yahweh, right, the God of the Israelites. And but it says specifically God, right? So this is Jacob's God here. This is our God. God is a witness between you and me. And he goes, if you afflict my daughters or take other wives, God's watching you. So keep yourself in check. And I think that's important there, because at some point, Laban's starting to get this. Right? And it doesn't say anything after that necessarily about that. But that just goes to show the people who are around, we still have an effect on. And so he's at least understanding enough that he's saying, God is your witness. And I don't know if that's because he's going, this is your God, so this is your witness, or if he's just plain out saying, God's watching you. So don't be doing nothing crazy to my daughters.
Then, verse 51, then Laban said to Jacob, here is this heap, and here is this pillar, which I have placed between you and me. This heap is a witness, and this pillar is a witness, that I will not pass beyond this heap to you, and you will not pass beyond this heap and this pillar to me for harm. The God of Abraham, the God of Nahor, and the God of their father judge between us. And Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. Then Jacob offered a sacrifice on the mountain and called his brethren to eat bread. And they ate bread and stayed all night on the mountain. And early in the morning Laban arose and kissed his sons and daughters, blessed them. Then Laban departed and returned to his place. So they go through this. And this is during the time, obviously, that it had pillars. And they made these altars up there for the sacrifices. And it was like a visual reminder going, this is the covenant. God's watching you. And at this point, they've brought the brother in to continue this. And they build it all up, right? And they make this covenant. They're swearing on God and the fear of his father. And they offer the sacrifice. And then they stay up super late, it says right here. And then they arose early in the morning. Laban kissed his sons and daughters, blessed them, and Laban departed and returned to his place. And this kind of goes back up to this word mitzvah, right? He's saying, you stay on your side, I'll stay on my side. I will no longer hunt you down, and you don't come back over here and try to harm me. And I thought that was something that stood out there. I don't know if this was like a hope, like, hey, you guys could always come back, or like whatever, but he's saying in harm. So that's something to look at right there. And then he blesses them and departs and returns to his place. And that's the end of the chapter, guys. Anyone have any questions, comments, concerns? Dean, give us some wisdom. No wisdom? Okay. Father, thank you for this opportunity to teach, Lord. And I pray that one or two of these things that were read from your word today, Lord, would be on our hearts and we'd remember it throughout the rest of the week. And I just pray that the rest of the week, Lord, that we'd be seeking you and we'd turn to you first, Lord. And you would be with us, keep all of our friends and family safe, Lord, throughout the rest of the week. And that we'd be looking for you, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.